Germany's Merkel suffers blow as FDP pulls out of coalition talks. The free market liberal FDP pulled out after 4 weeks of talks with Mrs. Merkel's CDU/CSU bloc and the Greens. FDP leader Christian Lindner said there was no basis of trust between them. President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said Germany was facing an unprecedented situation and that he would hold talks with all parties. He said this would include parties that not had been involved in the talks so far and called on politicians to work together and make compromises for the well-being of the country. He acknowledged rising concern in neighboring countries about the situation. Earlier Mrs. Merkel said she regretted the collapse. CDU Deputy Chairman Armin Laschet told journalists that Mrs. Merkel had held a conference call on Monday morning with the party leadership and had retained its support. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats, led by Martin Schulz, have again ruled out joining another grand coalition with Mrs. Merkel's bloc. "We are not afraid of new elections," Mr. Schulz said. Mrs. Merkel's bloc won September's poll, but many voters deserted the mainstream parties. "As Chancellor, I will do everything to ensure that this country is well managed in the difficult weeks to come," she said. This is, for post-war Germany, an unprecedented political crisis that could spell the end of the Merkel era. Weakened by a poor election result in September, the proposed coalition was Mrs. Merkel's only shot at forming a new government. Germany will now, in all probability, have to go back to the ballot box. But it's not at all certain that Mrs. Merkel's party will want her to lead them into a fresh election. The ensuing uncertainty has consequences beyond Germany. Mrs. Merkel, who did not attend a summit of EU leaders in Sweden last week, will remain preoccupied with domestic affairs for some time yet. "This was," she said last night, "a time for deep reflection." Mrs. Merkel must now fight for political survival. The leader who for so many people has represented stability now is fast becoming a symbol of crisis in the heart of Europe. The parties involved in the talks are reported to be deeply divided over tax, asylum and environmental policies. Although rumors had spread that a deal was close, the FDP's leader emerged from the venue in the middle of the night surrounded by his party colleagues and told reporters that the party was leaving the process. He said that while the FDP knew it could not steer the course of the entire republic with just 11% of the vote, the parties involved in talks had no shared vision of how the country should be modernized, and 4 weeks of talks had left them with many inconsistencies, unanswered questions and conflicts. "It is better not to rule than to rule badly. Goodbye," Mr. Lindner said. The co-leader of the Greens, Simone Peter, said the FDP had been irresponsible, dubious and calculating. Her party colleague Katrin Göring-Eckardt said the Greens had been ready to talk and found a much greater understanding with the CDU and FDP through the talks, especially over migration politics, climate change and agriculture. Mrs. Merkel blamed differing cultures and styles for the collapse but said, "We think we were on a path to finding a solution." But a spokesman for her party, Stefan Meyer, told the BBC he did not think the FDP ever intended to join the coalition. "I have the impression that it was planned for a long time to quit the negotiations and not to form this coalition," he said. What happens next? There are a few options. Mrs. Merkel could form a minority government, for instance with the Greens. But this would leave her having to patch together support for every vote, a big change for a leader who has been used to ruling as part of a grand coalition. Some hope that despite Social Democrat, SPD, leader Martin Schulz again ruling it out, another grand coalition could still be agreed between Mrs. Merkel's